Hey everybody, this is Matt, and I am going to start our lecture for actually week 2 and week 3, talking all about security and police organization. Now, when I created this lecture, and I'm sorry if this is confusing to you, but I don't think it will be when we get done. When I started this lecture and I looked at these two chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 3 out of our text, I just didn't think that it made sense to break them up. It made more sense to do this all as one lecture. It certainly made it easier on me. I'm hoping it'll make it easier on you as well. So I put this all together in one lecture. So what that means is you're watching this lecture for week number 2, for your discussion board, for your test, all of that. And then you're also watching it for week number 3 at the same time. So actually you're getting to work about a week ahead, at least in terms of taking notes, outlining, and watching your lecture, getting ready. So hopefully this is helpful to you, but we'll go through it and I'll explain to you what I'm talking about as we go through. Okay, so we're talking about two things in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Two concepts, but they're so intertwined. Number one is the security of the United States. How do we secure the United States? That is a function of law enforcement throughout the entire United States. And then in chapter 3, how do we organize the police department? So because we're studying policing, specifically, how do we organize municipal police departments, sheriff's departments, agencies like that? So let's start off by talking about and looking at the United States as a whole and trying to really understand what it all looks like. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, perceptions can sometimes be shattered by learning actual facts, and that's why I really like to highlight these. So, of all the law enforcement we have in the U.S., 77% of those police officers are local police officers. That means they work for agencies like Caldwell or Nampa or Boise Meridian, something like that. 77%. So almost all of the police officers in the United States are local. Now, when we say police, we're referring to anybody with a police function, a law enforcement function, a function where they can make arrests. So we're talking about FBI, we're talking about border control, we're talking about everybody. Of all those people, 77% are local municipal agencies. Now, what's unique to the United States and what's important to understand is that United States law enforcement developed based on a philosophy of local control. This goes all the way back to the founding of the country, all the way back to the American Revolution, where we wanted to give as much control to local communities as possible. Now, as you get into higher level classes, you quite possibly will find yourself reading the Federalist Papers that were written in support of the Constitution of the United States, trying to get it ratified during the Constitutional Convention. And you will see how the people who wrote this. Okay, so James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton actually wrote the Federalist Papers. And in there they talk quite a bit about the importance of local government. Therefore, when they founded this country, they believed that local governments were going to have or wield as much power as federal government. So they believed that collectively, the local governments of, say, cities like Boise, Nampa, Homedale, whatever it may be, collectively, they would be able to offset the power of the federal government. Now, that did not work out the way they anticipated. That's not what this class is about, but I do want to tell you about this so you understand why we have so many different police agencies in the United States. We have a lot, more than any other country. Almost every other country in the United States has policing with some federal oversight, some federal control or national control over how policing gets done on a local level. We do not have that in the United States. The annual cost in the United States for local, county, state, and federal police is about $185 billion, but this is an old statistic. I'm sure that has gone up since I originally wrote this PowerPoint. Okay, so let's look at agencies and how they break down. And so this is what I want to emphasize. We have over 15,000 full-time law enforcement agencies in the United States, and that is only counting state and local agencies. So like state police, highway patrol, sheriff's departments, police departments. That's it. That's all that's in that category, over 15,000. Now, state police and local police, the federal government has no authority to tell them how to police. Now, if they're violating the Constitution and how they're policing, yes, the federal government can get involved, and there's a lot of constitutional law that goes into that, and they can step in and say you're violating people's 8th Amendment rights or 4th or whatever that may be, and they can get involved. But as long as they're not violating people's civil rights, the federal government has no say over how these 15,000 full-time law enforcement agencies conduct policing. Now think about that for a moment. That is unique to the United States. Unbelievably unique to the United States. The federal government cannot come into Garden City and say, you're not enforcing DUIs enough. You have too many DUI crashes. You need to start enforcing DUI law more. Garden City can say, nah, that's not where our interest lies, and no thank you. And there's nothing the federal government can do about that. That's different than every other country in the whole world. So we're very unique in that respect. Now, when you look at federal law enforcement, there are, and this has gone up too since I wrote this, but that's okay. It's a good guideline for this lecture. 105,000 full-time federal employees that are authorized to carry firearms and make arrests. It's very interesting what goes on in the federal government when it comes to law enforcement. So many of the federal agencies have regulations, and ultimately the only way to enforce a regulation is to at least have the ability to take somebody's freedom away, the ability to actually make an arrest. Well, if you left federal law enforcement the ability to have somebody from the federal government come out and make an arrest, if you left that up to just the main law enforcement agencies we think about, the FBI, the ATF, the federal marshals, you could even lump in Border Patrol in there. If you left it up to just those agencies, and you had an agency like, the GSA. If you had, say, the GSA, and they were regulating or looking into a case of fraud where somebody was, say, stealing from people by selling cars but rolling the odometers back. So they're selling used cars, but they're making it look like the used car has a lot less miles on it than it actually does. Well, this case would probably not be a very high priority for the FBI. The FBI would be like, look, we're dealing with counterterrorism, we're dealing with gangs, we're dealing with white-collar crime, we're not worried about odometer fraud. So if the GSA, if they wanted to get somebody to come out and actually make an arrest on a case to get somebody to finally comply or at least stop their behavior, they might not be able to get anybody to come. So what has gone on in the federal government is these different governmental agencies, they have developed law enforcement ability within some of their employees. So almost all these different federal agencies have people that belong to that particular agency who are sworn federal law enforcement officers. It's really, really wild. When I was a sergeant at the Boise airport, and we would have federal, because all federal law enforcement, just with their ID, can fly armed on commercial aircraft. So they would come and check into the airport and into the secure area in a different way, and they would have to identify themselves to us. It was amazing, all the different federal agencies that came through that door that you would never think would have law enforcement powers, but they did. It was really, really interesting. So 105,000 full-time federal employees authorized to carry firearms and make arrests. Okay, now back to these local police departments. Think about the statistic for a minute. 87% of police departments have 25 or fewer officers. Almost 9 out of 10 police departments in the United States have 25 or fewer officers. That includes almost no agencies right here in the Treasure Valley. Caldwell has more than that. Nampa has more than that. Meridian has more than that. Garden City has more than that. Boise has way more than that, right? But the vast majority of police departments throughout the United States are very small, very local, with less than 25 officers. But when we think about police agencies in the United States, we tend to think about Los Angeles. We think about Portland. We think about Chicago or New York or Boston or Dallas or some place like that has a lot of officers. But they're actually not very representative of what most police departments in the United States actually look like. All right, now let's talk about Indian and tribal police. Now, you can see that there's a blue hyperlink there. And if we were in my face-to-face class, I would click on that and I would show you a YouTube video. But I can't do that because since it's somebody else's video, and since I make this PowerPoint into a video so you can watch it, YouTube thinks I'm trying to steal somebody else's video and make it mine, so I can't do that. So this is the first example. To watch this video, what I want you to do is just pause on this video for a second, click out into the folder that says lecture videos. I can't remember what I titled it, but you'll see this one up on top, and I've got 2 videos in there on policing in Indian country, and then you can see the blue hyperlink down at the bottom. I've got another one on gangs on Indian reservations. So I want you to watch those as well, okay? But we'll talk about this for a second. So it's really interesting how laws work on Indian reservations. So I'm assuming you're back from watching those videos, and we'll jump into this. So it's very interesting how laws on Indian reservations work. They're a combination of both tribal law and federal law. That's who has jurisdiction on Indian reservations because they are supposed to be sovereign nations, but it's this weird melding of they do fall under the umbrella of the United States, and so they adhere to both of those. So local policing there is conducted by tribal police officers with their laws and their traditions, their customs. But when somebody is violating felony law, then that is going to be prosecuted by the federal government and investigated by the FBI. That is who has the jurisdiction and the responsibility to conduct investigations of felony crimes on Indian reservations. What's interesting about that is that the FBI is spread pretty thin. After the attacks of September 11th, they've been very busy with counterterrorism and everything else they've got going on. So what you hear coming out of Indian reservations is that felony law enforcement and prosecution on those reservations is a low priority for the federal government. So for the U.S. Attorney's Office, who's responsible for prosecuting, for the FBI, who's responsible for investigating, there's not as much getting done as they would like to see, and so we're seeing sexual assault, homicides, and things like that go unprosecuted, and in some cases not even thoroughly investigated on Indian reservations. So I want to make sure and touch on that, make sure have you watch those videos and check that out. Now, one of the other models we have is state law enforcement, and I'm going to break this down just really quick to just give you an example. So when we talk about state law enforcement, there's really 2 models. The first one we'll call a centralized model, and that is where you have one agency, and they're responsible for doing a number of things when it comes to law enforcement in the state. Major criminal investigations, state highway patrol, assisting local police departments with, it could be with forensics, it could be with investigations, it could be with personnel if something's going on. You've probably all heard of the festival that takes place in northern Nevada called Burning Man. A lot of people go out there. That is a very desolate and barren area of northern Nevada. There are not a lot of people out there, and there's not a lot of law enforcement. But this creates issues. Now, there's some other factors there. For example, Burning Man takes place on public ground, so the federal government has some jurisdiction. So they send some law enforcement out there through the Bureau of Land Management. But when it comes to things like that, a festival that gets going in an area, bringing in thousands and thousands of people, and they have just a small law enforcement presence because 364 other days of the year, there's only, 3,000 people that live there. They need help. The state police can come in and help them with that. If you've got a small agency, but they've got a major crime scene, a major homicide or investigation, they don't have the training or the staff to handle it, the state police department can come in and help with that. Now, the decentralized model of state law enforcement is one where we used to see this in California. They've changed, and I actually don't know if there's a state that does this anymore, but there may be. And this is where you have divisions in state law enforcement. So, for example, when I was a kid growing up in California, we had the California Highway Patrol, and we had California State Police. That was the division of law enforcement. And the California State Police, they did things like they guarded the state capitol, and if there were major investigations to be done in the state, they would be the ones to take care of them. But now it's all under the umbrella of the Highway Patrol in California. They've eliminated the California State Police. So there were some decentralized models where they had both. I'm not sure if we still have that anywhere, but definitely something you should know about. Federal law enforcement. Let's talk about this for a minute. So federal government, they have the authority over a limited number of crimes, but this has really grown over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Throughout the history of the United States, federal government's had very, very little authority to come out and enforce laws. When we get to the part in this semester where we talk about search and seizure, United States versus Weeks, those cases, then we'll talk more about how that developed and how that came about. But this, over the last, say, half of a century, has really multiplied. We have the Department of Justice. Of course, there's a blue link there, so make sure you watch that video in our folder on Blackboard. We have the Department of Justice, and they are the primary legal and prosecutorial arm of the United States government. And they're dealing with crimes, taxes, civil rights. I should include in there terrorism, all of that. Right? That's who's going to do the prosecution for the United States government. And then, of course, we have the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. This has grown since I wrote this as well. Over 12,560 special agents. They offer assistance to states, to local law enforcement. They also have their own investigations they're conducting. They work on task force with local law enforcement. I'll give you an example. When I was a detective, we had still the largest case that Boise PD has ever dealt with, and that was the homicide of a young man named Robert Manuel. Ultimately, it turned out that he had been murdered by his mom's boyfriend, and mom and the boyfriend were covering it up, but they had reported it as though he was abducted by a stranger. And so this turned into a major investigation for us with all sorts of help from the community, from other law enforcement agencies, and ultimately the FBI sent in a special team of agents who were focused on nothing other than stranger abduction of children. And whenever one of these popped up around the country, they flew to it. So they flew into Boise, and they assisted us with the investigation. Okay, other federal law enforcement agencies, and this list is not exhaustive, but you've got the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. If you want to watch something fascinating, there is a series on Netflix, Narcos, which is about the DEA. They did one in Colombia dealing with Pablo Escobar and the different drug cartels down there, and then they did one in Mexico dealing with the cartels and the formation of the cartels in Mexico. Really fascinating stuff. Really, really interesting stuff. So that's one I'd watch. I think it's worth your time to watch it. The U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, the Treasury, the IRS, they've got law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, the Secret Service. They don't just protect the president and other dignitaries. They also investigate counterfeiting and counterfeit money. So interesting little nuance there. Department of the Interior. So the Department of the Interior says, say they've got the National Park Service. They have law enforcement rangers at the national parks. If you've ever gone over to Yellowstone or someplace like that, you'll see some rangers driving around and some driving around with lights and stuff on top of their car, and they're armed. That's your law enforcement rangers. The Bureau of Land Management, they've got law enforcement. The National Forest Service, they have law enforcement. And they all fall under the Department of the Interior. United States Postal Service, they've got postal inspectors with law enforcement authority. The Border Patrol, obviously, they do as well. And these are in blue, so these are videos you're going to want to watch on Blackboard. The Border Patrol video that's up there, just letting you kind of learn about the Border Patrol from their perspective, what they're saying. There's a video I've got up there of just it sounds like a truck driver and his wife going through a Border Patrol's check station, probably in, well, any of the border states. So California, Arizona, New Mexico, or Texas. I have driven through several of these down in Texas. They have the authority. They've got the legal authority affirmed by the United States Supreme Court, where for public safety, public service, they can do a brief detention. So basically a check station where they can stop you really quick, ask some questions about where you're going, where you're coming from, that type of stuff. And during that time, they can make observations. And if they see anything that indicates that you might be harboring or transporting somebody who is illegally immigrating into the United States, then they can escalate the investigation and they can detain you longer. But if they don't see anything, it's only a brief detention and then they have to let you go. So that's why when you watch this video, you'll see vehicles coming into the check station and leaving very quickly. That is because of the adherence to the constitutional law that is dictated for something like what the Border Patrol is doing at these check stations. Another thing when you watch this video, what I want you to see is that as the truck driver is coming in, there's a bunch of different cameras that are taking pictures at all different angles. License plate, vehicle, make, description, the people who are sitting in the cab, all sorts of stuff. So it's interesting what they're doing on the southern border to try and regulate this. I'll just give you a quick anecdotal example of something I observed the last time I was down there. And that was, I was driving along these very nice state highways in Texas, and I had purposely driven on the southernmost highway that was going from the area of Marathon, Texas to Del Rio, Texas. You can look that up on the map if you want. I think the state highway is Highway 89, but I can't remember for sure. But here's what I do know. I wanted to go through Sanderson, Texas, because that's the town that the movie No Country for Old Men starts in. So I wanted to see Sanderson, Texas. And I'd been down in Big Bend National Park camping and exploring that area of the border. So I just wanted to follow the border over to Del Rio, because Del Rio is another town in the movie No Country for Old Men. So if you're not getting the hint, I like that movie quite a bit. I've read the book. I think it's a really good movie. But anyway, I digress. So I was driving that road, driving the southernmost highway in Texas. So to the south of me was nothing but desert, and then the Rio Grande River, and then Mexico. And as I was driving along this highway, I noticed on the side of the highway there was like another road, like a frontage road, but it was dirt. But I call it a road because it was groomed. It was perfect. It was like somebody had come along and just smoothed it out, which they actually had. And I was following this road for hundreds of miles. I mean, Texas is a big state. And I'm going, what in the world? Why do they have this dirt road right next to this great highway? Why would they put any money into this? And about every 10 miles or so, I would see a big set of tractor tires. They were just laying on that dirt road. So they're blocking the dirt road. And they had a chain wrapped around them. And my confusion just grew. Like, what are these things doing here? Why do they even exist? Well, eventually, I caught up with a Border Patrol pickup. So a Border Patrol officer had chained one of those sets of tires up to the back of their pickup, and they're driving down this dirt road, basically. It's about the width of one vehicle, and they're smoothing it out. They're dragging tires down it, and they're smoothing it out. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me what was going on. The only thing to the south of that dirt road was desert and the Rio Grande. And since we don't have sophisticated electronic surveillance all along our southern border, they were using this very smoothed out dirt road with no footprints in it. So if they got a report or a sighting of somebody saying, hey, somebody crossed the river, they've entered the country illegally, they would just drive down that dirt road looking for footprints. And when they finally found the footprints, then they would know that the people who had come across into the country illegally were somewhere in that area. They could backtrack it based on time, know how fast people can move on foot through that type of terrain, and draw a radius and go out and find them with electronic surveillance equipment, using like a FLIR or infrared or something like that. So it was very unsophisticated, but at the same time, I bet it was very effective, because there was no way for people to get across that smoothed out road without leaving their footprints. It just wasn't going to happen. So it blew me away to be down there to see that, and to see just how we're just dragging a road so we can find footprints. It seemed like we should be so much more sophisticated than that, but on the other hand, that obviously would work. All right, so check out those videos, and then come back in here to this slide, police organization. So when we talk about, and so we're kind of transitioning here, everybody, from chapter 2 to chapter 3, just to let you know. But we're gonna be jumping into what police organization looks like here. So when we talk about police organization, the first thing you need to know is that it's a bureaucracy. Okay, the police, we do try and serve people well and with respect, but they're not the type of organization where if they don't make a profit, they're going to go out of business. They have no competition, and what they say goes. So to a point. So they're a bureaucratic organization, which means there's a hierarchy. There are people in the organization that have more authority than other people, right? Promotion is supposed to be based on merit and skill. You develop a career of service in a police organization, so you get you get like a pension when you retire. You develop seniority along the way, more and more vacation and things like that. There are rules and regulations. Certainly, in a police organization, there's a lot of rules and regulations, a lot of policy. I mean, anytime you're given the authority to take away somebody's freedom, or even in certain circumstances, use force that could take away their life, there's got to be rules and regulations, right? Clear boundaries, so things that we can do and things that we cannot do as police officers. So if you go to page 35 in your book, there's an organizational chart. Just want to draw your attention to that to try and help you start getting a realistic kind of idea in your mind of what a police department looks like, how it is organized. Now, it's organized into a paramilitary structure. This goes all the way back to Robert Peel in 1829. So what do we mean by that? Well, there's a chain of command. So a chain of command, those of you who have not been in the military, basically means that if you want to speak to somebody that's a higher rank than you, you have to go through the chain of command. Now, if you're let's say you're a patrol officer, you want to speak with your sergeant, you talk directly to your sergeant because your sergeant is the next person up from you in your chain of command. But if you want to speak with your lieutenant, you go through the sergeant, and the sergeant speaks to the lieutenant. If you want to speak to the captain, you go through your sergeant, the sergeant goes to the lieutenant goes to the captain. Now, I don't want to make it sound like in a police department it's this rigid. It's not. It is not. I could go speak with my captain whenever I wanted. If I saw the chief in the hall or I wanted to go chat with the chief, I could go to the chief's office and I could chat with the chief. But when it came to things of substance, policy decisions, command at, say, a critical incident or at a, like a dangerous situation, we're putting an incident command structure into play or something like that, then we have to follow the chain of command. You can't leapfrog people. You need to do what you're told because there's no other way to organize something like that in a safe way if we don't follow the chain of command. So let me give you an example. We had a situation when I was still a sergeant at Boise PD where we were going to go do a welfare check on a guy. This guy had gone to his neighbor's house. He was a veteran. He had some PTSD that he was dealing with, and I should just say post-traumatic stress. And he had gone to his neighbor's house with a shotgun and a bandolier of shotgun shells over his shoulder. And he said crazy things about President Obama. This is back when Obama was still president. Then he went home. That was it. He didn't threaten those people, but he was obviously having a very bad day. And they were concerned. So they called us to check on him. So I decided that we weren't just going to walk up to his front door because it was too potentially dangerous. So we set up a big call, honestly. We had officers staged all over. We had a massive perimeter. We had people watching the house with rifles just in case this person came out and decided to start using force with the firearm. And that would have been very, very unfortunate. Don't get me wrong. But it's one of those things we need to do so we could contact this person. We ultimately decided to contact him from about 6 houses away through a loudspeaker to avoid walking up to the house. Well, during all of this, we can't have everybody running around doing whatever they want to do. We need to give people an assignment, and then they need to follow that assignment and only deviate from that if the chain of command allows it or instructs them to do so. And we can't have them going to the lieutenant who's got a set of responsibilities and saying, hey, I don't think I should be on this corner, I think I should be on this corner. That's for the person who has been placed right directly above you in your chain of command so we can keep everything organized, we can know where everybody is, and we can keep things safe. Or we might be making command decisions 3 or 4 steps above you at the patrol level that you don't know about, and you might have a great idea, but you don't have the whole picture. And if you don't have the whole picture, then you can't make a good judgment on what we're doing. So that's why a chain of command is so crucial. You're probably wondering about this call. We actually ended up calling out to him over a loudspeaker. Turns out he was up on his roof. We had an officer on this perimeter actually spotted him up on the roof with the shotgun. So if we'd have walked up to the front door, we don't know what he would have done, but he was up on the roof with a shotgun. So he would have had a distinct advantage over us and could have really hurt some officers, or a situation could have arisen where we ended up using deadly force on him. That never happened. I was really happy about that. But he stood up on the roof almost pointed the gun at an officer, which would have been bad. He was having a very bad day. And anyway, we ended up being able to get him help. Nobody got hurt. We didn't use any force on him. It worked out very well in the end. So that's how that all kind of ended. Okay, other things that are paramilitary. Law enforcement has uniforms, just like the military. Now, what color do you associate with law enforcement uniforms in the United States? Now, we're getting a wider array of these all the time, but this goes back to 1829 and Robert Peel as well. And if you remember from our first lecture and from Chapter 1, the British people were between a rock and a hard place. Do we give all this authority over to the government to create a police force, or do we continue to live with no police protection from all the crime that's going on? So one of the ways that Robert Peel appeased those fears is saying, we're not going to be the military. We're not putting soldiers in London to watch over you. So, since British military uniforms were red, he made the uniforms of the police department blue, right? So we have uniforms, but we have different colors, so we don't appear to be militaristic. And that's where the blue uniform in the United States comes from, is directly from that. We're authorized to use force. It could be many different types of force. We'll talk about that later in the semester, from deadly force to verbal commands. But we're authorized to use force, authorized to carry weapons. So those are a few of the reasons we call law enforcement paramilitary, because there are similarities, but then there are obviously distinct differences there as well. Okay, let's talk about span of control really quick. So what is span of control? Span of control is the number of officers that a supervisor can effectively supervise. Okay? That's about, I don't know, look at your book to confirm this, but it's 8 to 10, somewhere in there is what researchers have found. Police officers are making so many decisions just in the course of one shift that it would be impossible for a supervisor to be deeply involved with all of those decisions. And when you multiply that by having 8, 10 officers that you're supervising, that's really about all a supervisor, a sergeant, can supervise effectively. Because you get much more than that. There's just too much going on. There's so many different decisions, and we're applying the law and search and seizure and all these different things to so many different types of scenarios throughout the day that there's no way that a supervisor could effectively supervise that many more officers. And so let's talk about delegation of responsibility really quick. I put down here as opposed to firefighters. If you ever watch a TV show, there's a TV show called Rescue Me. It's about firefighters, but it's really not. It's about human drama and this one guy and blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of offensive stuff in the show, but there's a lot of stuff they show about firefighters. And when they get on a fire truck, and this is taking place in New York City, they're sitting out a chief, they're sitting out a lieutenant, and then they've got their driver of the fire engine. They've got all these other people. They have a specific delegation of responsibility, and decision-making goes to one person. Now, if you look at the way the city of Boise Fire works, when a fire truck or a fire engine would show up, you'd have the driver, and then sitting in the front passenger seat was the lieutenant, and then usually you'd have a third person sitting in the back. That was the hosesman. If you went and you tried to speak with the driver or the hosesman, they would just point at the lieutenant and say, go talk to him. The lieutenant made all the decisions. They just carried out the lieutenant's decisions. That is a lot different than law enforcement, because in law enforcement, we're delegating this decision-making responsibility to all of the different police officers. They are making decisions all day long, when to arrest, when to enter a home, when to get a search warrant, all day long, without a supervisor telling them, do this, do this, do this. So that's one of the things I like most about being a police officer, is it was very challenging in that I had to figure out my own way to apply both substantive and procedural law to the different scenarios I was running into all day long. And that's a really rewarding part of the career. All right. Lots of rules and regulations we talked about before. If and when you become a police officer or work in a police agency, you'll become very familiar not only with whatever state you're working in, not only with their laws, but with all of the different policies and procedures that the police department is going to make you understand. Police departments, they have sworn and non-sworn members. These numbers are a little bit dated, but unfortunately they're still pretty accurate from what I understand. Boise Police Department, about 320 sworn officers. Those are people who can go arrest people for warrants. They can go and they can be an affiant on a search warrant and serve it. They carry guns. They have the authority to arrest and use force. But obviously their mission is backed up by non-sworn personnel, people who are civilian employees but are doing things essential like dispatchers, records clerks, people like that. So an agency is never just the officers that you see. And the non-sworn people in the agencies do not have peace officer powers. Now let's talk about rank structure. This is going to be a question on your test when you get to it. And this can vary from agency to agency. So use this one for the purpose of this class. So the highest rank in a police agency is the chief, followed by the deputy chief, followed by a captain, by a lieutenant, by a sergeant, by a corporal or a master officer, then by a field training officer, then by a patrol officer or just an officer. And underneath all of them is the probationary officer, the officer who's been hired, who is still on probation. They can still be fired at will without civil service protection. So that's kind of the rank structure there, and that is also your chain of command. If the officer disagrees with a new policy put out by his captain or her captain, they have to go through all these people that are in between them. Now, I've written in here field training officer. Generally, a field training officer only is in the chain of command above somebody who is going through the FTO program. We haven't talked about that yet. We will in selection and development of police officers, but in that case, they are in this chain of command. So I included them. Corporal or master officer, when I was at Boise PD, we did not have them in the rank structure, meaning they weren't working as a supervisor, but we did have in our policy that on any given call, the officer with the most seniority is the person that was technically responsible for making sure that things went appropriately on that call. Well, that's generally going to be the corporal or the master officer if they've achieved that designation through their career so far. So I included them on the chain of command as well. So, and on the rank structure. So just make sure that you use this one for class. Like I said, it's not going to apply to every agency. There's no way for me to give you an example of every single agency. That would just be too long of a list. Okay, so we've got personnel issues. What do we do with officers when they transfer in from other agencies? This has always been a big question. I've done it twice. I transferred in California to the sheriff's office that I wanted to work for, and ultimately came into Boise PD as a transfer as well, which means I had more experience than a lot of officers that were working at that agency already, and a lot of officers that were getting hired at the same time as me. So do I get paid the same? Do I have to go through the police academy again? Do I start over on seniority? How does all of this work? That's an issue that agencies deal with when they try and hire officers that come in from other agencies with experience. Police unions, yes, we have unions. Boise Police has a union, but it's illegal to go on strike. So you've got to deal with how you negotiate and how you wield your leverage when it comes to being a union differently. Police reserves, who are these? These are folks that are either paid or volunteer, and they are out there to work as police officers when needed. Basically, if there's an event going on and we need a lot of officers and we just can't staff it, you can have part-time or volunteer police officers come in. That's the reserve force, and they can help to bolster that. And police reserves do a lot of good work in this country. A lot. I've worked with a lot of reserves, and there were some very good ones. And, man, they make great contributions. And most of the time when I worked with reserves, they were volunteers. They were doing it for free. We have different assignments in police departments. We have beat assignments. That comes from the old adage of beating the street. So walking in the area that you're supposed to be in. And, of course, this goes back to Robert Peel with him wanting to stage police officers in different areas of London and make them visibly present. Today we have beat assignments. It generally takes place in a car. Those beat assignments can rotate, or you can be assigned to them for a long time, so you get to develop relationships with people who live there. We have districts and we have divisions. So I'll give you an example. At Boise PD, we have the bench and the valley. I guess we'll call that a district. So those are two separate patrol teams, but same function. But then we have different divisions. We have patrol, we have investigations, we have community outreach and things like that. And so we break police departments down in that way for span of control by different captains, lieutenants, however they may organize it. A tour, that's basically your shift. And at Boise PD, we had a day shift, we had swing shift, and we had night shift. And definitely there were different types of crimes going on during different shifts. Day shift was a lot of crime that took place last night, and people discovered it when they woke up this morning, so you took a lot of reports that day of burglaries and vandalism and hit and runs and things like that. Swing shift, and especially graveyard or night shift, a lot more crimes that were actually in progress. They're happening right now, and people are calling them in because the bad guys have woken up and they're getting busy. And then usually by about 3, 4 in the morning, on night shift it gets pretty quiet. You do reports, and there's not a whole lot going on until things get going 7 or 8 in the morning. All right, use of force. This is the last thing I'm going to leave you with in this lecture. It is not simple. I've got 2 videos for you to watch. They're in the Blackboard shell, of course. The first one is a shoot, don't shoot scenario. I want you to watch this. This is a real thing that happened. Excuse me. And then after that, I'm going to have you watch an explanation of the U.S. Supreme Court case Graham versus Connor. And then it would be great if you went back and you watched the shoot, don't shoot again and see if your thoughts on whether or not the officer was justified in shooting make sense, or if your thoughts on that had changed. I want to give you a hint on the shoot, don't shoot video. There's a lot going on here where the officer has previous knowledge of the person who's in the passenger seat. He finds a gun. He's telling the person to stay in the car. The person's not complying. He's forcing his way out of the car. See if you watching this, knowing those facts, and also know that the officer who is the one who is dealing with the person in the passenger seat has met this person before and has had his life threatened by this person before and knows that this person is a drug dealer who carries firearms. All of that factors into this. So after you watch Graham versus Connor, go back and watch this again. Pause it in places right before the shooting happens and ask yourself, based on what you've learned through Graham versus Connor, could this be reasonable? Even though this guy's putting his hands up and he gets shot, think about the officer's frame of mind and everything the officer has tried to do to avoid shooting this gentleman and what the officer is worried about, and then how much time does an officer really have to make a split-second decision over whether or not this person's going to harm them. Think about all the different factors and see if you apply Graham versus Connor to this case, if it changes your mind on this at all. I put the Fourth Amendment up here for you, and the reason why is because use of force is governed by the Fourth Amendment. The use of force is considered a seizure. And, of course, use of the Fourth Amendment deals with what is a reasonable search and also a seizure. And use of force is considered a seizure because we are using force to seize that person, to restrict their freedom in one way or another. So I wanted you to see that as well. All right, everybody, please let me know if you have questions on this. Enjoy Week 2 and Week 3. Look forward to seeing what you have to say about all this.